I would film a video on the hottest day of the year. Everyone is capable of narrating their own perspective of the world in a unique way, from our phones to our feeds, and everything in between. That is the real nature of human curiosity, and our obsession to share it. Film photography is my weapon of choice in this pursuit, and it seems over the last year or so, quite a few of you have joined in a similar journey. Let's face it, film photography is cool now, and it's well on its way to pushing into the ironic and oversaturated for some. A lot more photographers have re-entered the space, and for someone like me, that's really exciting and motivating. It means that film might actually be here to stay after all. But the problem with cool is its tendency to dictate rules, certain levels of expectations. And it's this fascination with gear that I can't seem to look past any further. When you think about a generic film camera in your head, a few iconic images come to mind, and companies are styling modern cameras to capitalize on this phenomenon. And this isn't a bad thing, this is just an answer for people that are wanting to return to tradition, or those that want to try out film but are a little too intimidated. I love my Nikon F2. It's one of the best tools, if not the best, I'll ever own in my lifetime, and will most likely outlive me if managed correctly. But you gotta admit, it's pretty f***ing cool. No one talks about how heavy and cumbersome it is to take on a hike, but if I have it with me in a Target parking lot, at least a few people will stop me and tell me how much they like my camera. And that's kind of what I'm becoming afraid of. The idea of using these cameras is not for the images they produce, but the aura they're giving your Wednesday fit. When we see these older cameras used as a prop in recent films, it's almost like a noticeable defining feature of that character's aesthetic, more so than they like to use that tool. I'm afraid we're one step closer to looking at all our images of classic cars and comparing them to the video of the trash bag in American Beauty. Cameras at the end of the day are boxes that house either a sensor or expose rolls of film. Some are faster, some are heavier, but they're just boxes that expose light with mounted glass. So why is it when you think of a film camera, it's always something like this, and never something like this? I currently own 3 cameras in this late 90s, early 2000s SLR traditional setup, one I've had for almost 2 years, while the others have been fairly more recent. And of course I have to preface that gear in no way controls your ability to capture great moments. In my opinion, it's all subjective. There's higher megapixel cameras, there's larger sensors, there's different film formats, there's better lenses. But the only true purpose of gear in my world is to have fun and to not miss the moment. So whatever tool can do that the best, that's what I want to use. While vintage cameras hold a certain nostalgic and aesthetic appeal, early 2000s SLR film cameras were superior in many practical aspects. They combined the tactile and visual qualities of film photography with technological advances that made them more reliable, easier to use for newcomers, and capable of producing higher quality images under a wider range of conditions. And best of all, they're noticeably a lot cheaper for the most part, like a lot cheaper. It honestly feels like some of these cameras are just thrown away at this point. There will always be an argument for more mechanical based cameras because a lot of these cameras I'm talking about are actually just glorified point and shoots when you think about them and their build quality. I mean, electrical and plastic parts just unfortunately equal a shorter lifespan, but maybe because of that makes them the best camera for someone just entering the hobby. Plenty of cameras like the Minolta X370 are a hybrid stepping stone to this idea, offering an automatic feature in its exposure, but aesthetically it carries the street cred of something much more manual. This Canon 2000 is just as capable of every manual feature and discipline as a Canon AE1, but with 2 major advantages: autofocus and a more refined light meter. There's a lot I want to get into, so I'll try to break it down the best I can between the good, the bad, and the overlooked, without having to get into that whole APS thing because no, we're not doing that again. First up on the list is my Rebel 2000, and yes, it still does have the digital strap on it.
It says digital on it though, because it's the only strap I have.
At this point, I think that's just part of the camera. So out of the 3 cameras I'm going to show you today, this is the one I've had the longest, and probably taken the most pictures with. When I just got out of college, the Rebel line of digital cameras was all the hype when using for short films or photography if you couldn't afford to get into a 7D or 5D. Back then, if you couldn't get into the higher end Canon cameras, the Rebel series was something that was pretty affordable but also attainable for college students. A lot of my actor friends used them for auditions. They were everywhere. I feel like they were the most overproduced cameras and everyone had one at one point. When I was first getting back into the hobby, this was a no-brainer. And I didn't go out searching for this camera on eBay or anything. I found it at a thrift shop and I think it was like $13. I'm still kicking myself because I think there were like 2 others there that day. I just want to pick tools that inspire me. And this got me really out of my comfort zone because my Nikon is super great for personal work and things when I'm out having fun, but stuff that was more fast-paced or really fleeting and quick, I felt like I was lagging when it came to my Nikon and I couldn't keep up. So this camera last year actually really helped me break out of my shell. You know, it's got aperture priority, it's got auto mode, it's got all these familiar modes when you're first getting into camera work, but it's also got full manual mode. You can change the ISO pretty easily. The only thing I will say about this camera is that, yeah, in some regard, the coloring, the like gray kind of paint job that it's given, in a lot of ways makes it come across as not professional, which might hurt you if you were using this on a gig. Or there's an argument some people make that these cameras are really great because they're incognito, because you see them and you instantly think that person has no idea what they're doing. But I think this camera actually might bring a little bit more attention just because of that off color. So it may not keep you always anonymous, but still a great camera. I've taken some really great photos on it. Love it to death. So the second camera I have for you is the Nikon N60. Again, this is something I found pretty cheap, and the difference between this camera and the Rebel 2000 is very substantial. This feels like a much better build. There feels like there's a lot more metal, it's heavy, like this is a durable camera. And honestly, it's got the weirdest sounding shutter I've ever heard. I don't know, there's something, it's almost like goofier. So one thing to note with the Nikon line though is when you're using lenses on these more advanced cameras, for whatever reason, you manually have to set your lenses to f11, f22, whatever your highest f-stop is, and then use the manual controls in the screen with the controls. You don't ever touch the lens, otherwise you're gonna get an error message. I don't know why that is, but this camera always does it, and it took me a while to figure that out. When I first found it, I actually thought maybe it was broken. I think that one I found for like $17, and that one was a bit more of a gamble because I knew less about it. I'm not as familiar with the Nikon line when it comes to their digital cameras or their late film cameras. I really only have my Nikon F and my Nikon F2, but the build quality really is insane on this. And if you can find one, I also see N65s pretty regularly. Maybe pick one up. And the last camera I'm picking out here has been in my rotation a lot recently, just because of its ability to load really fast and go. There's something about this one that is just a little bit different than the Rebel 2000, and that is my Canon EOS Kiss. There's quite a few EOS cameras out there that are on the more professional end. I mean, that famous scene in The Matrix was shot with these cameras. But there's something about these consumer ones that are just so light and convenient that make them a lot more enticing to invest in just because of their price. The big difference between this and the Rebel 2000, it's black, so it does have that sleek sort of invisibility that I like when it comes to cameras. Sometimes I'll even tape over the Canon to make it a little bit less flashy. And with my nifty 50 on here, or even a pancake 40mm lens, this camera can almost disappear. This has been a really great camera for street, and surprisingly also very good for landscapes, because the weirdest thing about this camera is its ability to do panel crops. It's essentially the same thing as a lot of point-and-shoot cameras, but having this feature on a camera that can mount L-series glass is insane. When you go to scan those, if you can scan them at high enough quality, I promise you'll never need an X-Pan. Liar! Yes, the detail is not totally the same, but images can look f***ing bonkers. It's not my favorite camera ever, but man, do I seem to be using it a lot lately. Especially when I'm working with a new film that I'm not as familiar with, and I just want to have a really accurate light reading. The only downside to this specific one is the LCD is starting to bleed, but for the most part I can still see the screen. I can see one day potentially that affecting this camera a lot more, completely covering that screen. I don't know, maybe at that point I get another one. It's also got this thumb groove in the back that is just so comfortable. The grip on the Nikon is also very comfortable because it's so big. There's so much to grab onto, but this is so light. You just throw your thumb right in that slot and it's perfect. I don't know, I've already put about 10 rolls through this camera and it's the newest thing in my collection. But they're all essentially the same camera with just a couple little changes, and maybe the knob for your settings is somewhere different. Put in aperture priority and just have a blast. It's no secret right now that digital is in a full revolution, moving away from its DSLR cameras into more mirrorless setups. This is the real cheat code of these cheaper SLR cameras that I see when it comes to shooting film. The ability to take these newer lenses and put them in front of celluloid, it creates a really interesting, sharp, but different look than what we're used to getting on vintage cameras. And they speak really well to these systems between the light meter and the autofocus. So just to showcase how much of a powerhouse these cameras can be, I took one to the fair last month to try and outdo myself from last year when I took my Canon E. I met up with the boys and we did a few laps to see what moments we could get among the madness. Admittedly, this day was a lot more crowded than last year, so at times we were feeling a bit overwhelmed, but I still managed to capture some of my favorite street shots I've taken in a while. In this lower lighting, I found the autofocus to be a bit hit or miss at times, but my ability to quickly zone focus with how bright these viewfinders are, I was able to capture focus pretty seamlessly. For some of these, I leaned into the feeling of fast-paced action and shot some slower shutter experiments to not only add some life and movement into the frames, but in essence that you can feel walking around the event. And I have to say with this one, I really nailed that for me. This photo is fantastic. The subject remains anonymous, the lighting from the setting sun is projecting this nice glow that almost looks like a flash fill, and the bulbs from the carousel create this familiar texture. This image just feels like a childhood memory, and I love it. Now, is cool something you should be worried about when looking for your intended look? Maybe. Honestly, aesthetics are an important part of your confidence coming through in the frame, but a Leica M6 sure isn't something that flies under the radar these days. Every time I watch a street photography vlog, there's a part of me that will always have an anxiety for the safety of not only the expensive gear, but its instant recognition influencing the moment. Maybe there's a scene you're really excited to capture, but the moment you lift up that $3,000 camera to your face, the subject may have taken notice and shifted their honest reaction into something that's a bit more staged or defensive. Whereas with something like this, if it didn't shoot 35, I'm not sure if anyone on the street would really know what this was. Its nonchalant nature almost implies that you're a student or a novice. And it's true, the parts in my Rebel 2000 will die one day. So will a Contax T2, and I'd be able to buy like 20 or 30 of these cameras before I even come close to spending the amount of money it takes to buy some of these point and shoots. And with something like this, I can tap into that lifespan of over 100 lenses that Canon and other companies have put out for a space that almost is rejecting them in this new mirrorless age, giving them purpose and new life. And I think that's pretty cool.